Dust Creek was the kind of place the wind forgot. A dying speck on the far edge of Apache country, where the land cracked like old leather and the sun bled red every evening. Once it had been a bustling outpost with miners, cattlemen, and the promise of gold. But by 1874, even the coyotes had grown thin. What remained was dust, ghosts, and a woman too stubborn to die. Mary Dalton, 27 years old and worn far past her years. Mary had come to Dust Creek as a bride at 19, full of light and wild dreams. Her husband, Thomas Dalton, had been a gambler and a man of tall words, promising her a grand ranch and a life of comfort. Instead, he left her a pile of debts, a broken corral, and a name the town spat when they thought she wasn't listening. Thomas was shot dead in a saloon brawl 2 winters back, and not a soul had mourned him. The preacher said he died owing more sins than silver. For Mary, the silence that followed was worse than grief. The ranch, her only home, began to rot from the inside. The roof sagged, the well dried, and one by one the hired hands rode off. She stayed. Not out of love for the land, but pride. Pride was all she had left. Each morning she rose before the sun, tying her late husband's coat around her shoulders, its sleeves hanging too long on her arms. She carried buckets from the stream half a mile away, her boots sinking into cracked mud. She mended fences, patched roofs, and buried the weak animals herself. The latest loss, her last mule, fell ill after a week of storms. When it finally collapsed by the fence, Mary knelt beside it in the heat, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She whispered a prayer, though she wasn't sure who she prayed to anymore. That's when she felt it, a presence, quiet and still, like the land itself had taken human form. She turned sharply, her hand flying to the rusted rifle propped beside her. A man stood at the edge of the corral. He was tall, broad-shouldered and bronzed from sun and wind. His hair was long, black as a raven's wing, tied loosely behind his neck. His clothes were worn leather, dust-covered, but neat. The lines on his face were neither young nor old. They carried the stillness of mountains and the memory of hardship. "Didn't hear you ride up," Mary said, voice hoarse from the dry air. He didn't move closer. I walked. His tone was calm, low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You Apache?" she asked cautiously, though she already knew the answer. He nodded once. "Taza," he said simply, touching his chest. Mary's grip on the rifle tightened. "What do you want, Mr. Taza?" His eyes flicked toward the dead mule, then back to her. "You bury alone?" "I do everything alone," she snapped. He didn't flinch, didn't scowl. He just looked at her, not with pity, but with something far rarer. Respect. Then, without another word, he took the shovel from where it leaned against the fence and began to dig. Mary stood frozen, watching him. Every strike of his shovel bit deep into the earth, steady and sure. When she tried to protest, he said nothing, just kept working. By the time the sun sank low, the grave was done. Together, they pushed the mule's body into the pit. He helped her cover it, one silent scoop of dirt at a time. When the last of the dust settled, Taza turned to her and said quietly, "You have good land, hard but strong." "Like you." Mary's throat tightened. "You don't know me," he met her eyes. "I know the way the wind bends but does not break." For the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. The wind caught her hair, the horizon burned gold, and something she thought long dead, flickered faintly inside her chest. The Apache turned to leave, his long stride carrying him toward the desert's edge. But before he disappeared into the twilight, he stopped, looked back, and said, "Tomorrow, I fix your well." And then he was gone, leaving only his footprints and a whisper in the wind that maybe, just maybe, her long solitude had ended. That night, as Mary sat by her cold hearth, the memory of his calm voice echoed in her mind. For the first time in years, Dust Creek didn't feel entirely empty. By dawn the next morning, Mary Dalton half believed she'd dreamed him, the Apache stranger who'd buried her mule and spoken like the wind itself. But when she stepped outside, the proof was there. A pair of fresh boot tracks leading from her well. The handle of her old shovel leaned neatly against the fence. And then she heard it, the sound of steady hammering. Her breath caught. Taza was back. He stood by the corral, shirtless under the white glare of the rising sun, his muscles working as he drove new boards into the fence with clean, sure blows. He'd already repaired the split well rope and replaced the bucket she'd given up for ruined. There was no wagon, no supplies, and no horse. Just him, silent, tireless, and focused. Mary crossed her arms, squinting against the light. "Didn't say you could come back," she called. Taza didn't look up right away. When he did, his dark eyes met hers without apology. "Didn't say I couldn't," he replied simply, setting another nail. She ought to have sent him away. A woman alone, letting an Apache stay. There wasn't a soul in Dust Creek who wouldn't twist that into poison by sundown. But she hesitated. The truth was, she needed the help. The well had gone bad, the roof leaked, and she was down to half a barrel of flour. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why are you doing this?" Taza straightened, the hammer resting against his thigh. "Because it should not all fall," he said. "Not yet," she frowned. "You don't even know me. I know this land," he answered. "And I know what it takes to stay when others run." There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that cut through her defenses. Without another word, she turned and went inside, telling herself she'd only let him work until the fence was done. Then he'd move on. But he didn't. By nightfall, Taza had mended the corral and stacked her woodpile higher than it had been in months. When she brought him a tin cup of coffee, he took it with a small nod. "You don't owe me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You feed me. I work." She realized then that was his way. No begging, no favors. Just trade. Honor for honor. As the days passed, Taza stayed. He rose before dawn, worked without complaint, and said little. Sometimes he'd vanish for hours, returning at dusk with a rabbit or fish for supper. Other times he'd sit by the corral carving shapes from wood, small, perfect animals that looked ready to leap from his hands. The first time she tried to pay him, he refused. "I am not your hired man," he said. "I do this because I choose," Mary bristled. "You'll bring me trouble, you know that? The town won't like it." He gave her a faint, almost amused smile. "They already don't." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the steady rhythm of his hammer, the low murmur of him speaking softly to the horses in Apache. It should have unsettled her. A stranger on her land, a man she barely knew. But instead there was a strange comfort in it. For the first time in years, the house didn't creak with emptiness. The next morning, Mary rode into town for supplies. As she tied her horse outside the general store, the whispers began. Mrs. Whitcomb from the boarding house leaned close to the preacher's wife. "She's got a savage living with her now," she hissed. "You mark my words, and next thing he'll burn that place to the ground." Mary's face burned, but she held her chin high. Inside, even the storekeeper hesitated to take her money. "You sure it's wise, Mary?" he muttered. "Those people ain't like us." Her voice was cold as steel. "No, they're better than most of you." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. She gathered her parcels and rode home. When she arrived, Taza was waiting by the gate. His sharp eyes took in her stiff posture and trembling hands. "They spoke against you," he said softly, as though he'd seen it already in her face. "Let them," she said. "I'm used to it." He studied her for a long moment, then said something that struck her harder than any insult ever could. "Used to pain is still pain, Mary Dalton." She didn't know how to answer. The sun sank behind the hills, bathing the ranch in red light. Taza turned back to his work without another word, and for a long while Mary simply watched him. The way he moved, the steadiness in him. She realized that Dust Creek had never truly been silent. It had just been waiting for something, someone, to fill it again, and that someone she feared, or perhaps hoped one, was him. Days blended into weeks at the Dalton Ranch, each one marked by Taza's quiet presence. Mary found herself noticing small things. The way he stooped to tie a stubborn knot without complaint, the careful way he lifted buckets of water from the well, the way his dark eyes flicked to the horizon as though he were always watching, always waiting. He worked without expectation of thanks, yet each action carried a weight that made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years. Mary was a woman of pride, honed by loss and loneliness. She had kept the ranch going with her own hands. She had survived hunger, storms, and the gossip of an entire town. She didn't need help. She refused to need help. And yet every time Taza carried another heavy beam across the yard, or quieted her frightened horses with a calm word in his native tongue, she felt a flicker of shame. Not for accepting his help, but for feeling relief in it. One afternoon, a sudden windstorm swept across the plains, whipping dust into the yard and rattling the weak barn doors. Mary fought against it, trying to secure loose boards, her hands raw and bleeding. She was halfway across the yard when she realized she was alone. But then a shadow fell over her. Taza had followed, moving with the easy certainty of a predator who knew the land and its dangers. "Here," he said, gripping her elbow gently but firmly, steadying her as she struggled against the wind. "You're strong, but strong alone is brittle." Mary jerked back instinctively. "I don't need you," he didn't argue. Instead, he simply adjusted a beam with one hand while holding her steady with the other. "Strong is better shared," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. For a long moment, she said nothing. She wanted to pull away, to preserve the fortress of self-reliance she had built over years of hardship, and yet for the first time, she felt the weight of loneliness lighten just a fraction. That evening, as the wind died and the sun dipped behind the distant mesas, Mary found herself sitting on the steps of the corral, her boots caked with mud, watching Taza work on a broken fence post. He didn't speak. He never did unless necessary, yet every action seemed to carry a message. Respect, patience, strength tempered with care. She remembered her husband, Thomas, who had promised her the world and left her with nothing but debts and disappointment. He had been loud, demanding, and selfish. Taza was nothing like him. Quiet, deliberate, dependable. He moved through her life like a shadow that didn't consume, a wind that steadied rather than tore. Mary found herself talking to him, though at first it was merely practical. "That post needs more nails," she said, pointing. "You missed one on the far side." He glanced up, acknowledging her correction with a simple nod, and adjusted the post. That small exchange, so ordinary, felt monumental. For the first time in years, she had someone who respected her knowledge, who didn't try to dominate her, who treated her as an equal. Days turned into nights filled with quiet companionship. They shared meals, simple fare, beans and bread, and sometimes they would sit in silence near the fire, listening to the wind whisper through the dry grasses. Mary realized something she hadn't dared admit. The ache in her chest, the relentless weight of isolation, was lifting. Taza's presence was not a crutch, but a partnership she hadn't known she could need. Yet pride remained. Every time she felt the pull toward warmth, toward trust, she stiffened. She was a Dalton. She had survived. She would survive. She did not need a man, Apache or otherwise, to anchor her life. But Taza, in his quiet, steady way, challenged her stubbornness without demanding it. He didn't invade her world, he reinforced it. Every act of strength, every gesture of patience, every silent acknowledgement of her skills chipped away at the wall she had built. That night, she lay awake, listening to the soft scrape of his hands on wood as he repaired the corral under the moonlight. Pride warred with something else inside her, something tender and unfamiliar. For the first time, she questioned whether surviving alone was truly enough, or whether the quiet strength of another could, in fact, make life worth living. And in the still darkness, Mary Dalton felt the faintest stirrings of trust. Dust Creek was small, and in a small town every whisper grew louder than the wind. Mary Dalton learned this the hard way. One bright morning she rode into town, her horse's hooves clopping against the dry, sun-baked street. A basket of flour and cornmeal balanced on the saddle horn. She hoped for a quick visit, supplies, a few words to the storekeeper, and back home before anyone noticed her presence. She should have known better. By the time she tied her horse outside the general store, a crowd had begun to gather, or perhaps she had just become aware of them. Sheriff Burke, a man whose face was as craggy as the mesa rocks and twice as stubborn, stepped forward with the air of someone claiming his piece of territory. "Mary Dalton," he barked, spittle catching in the sunlight. "You harboring a savage on your property?" The words cut through her, sharp as a whip. Heads turned, and a few men chuckled, while the saloon girls peered from doorways with scandalized eyes. "You let him sleep under your roof, and you call yourself a Dalton? Shame on you." Mary felt her cheeks burn, but she squared her shoulders. "I keep my property and my business," she said evenly, though her hands shook inside her gloves. "And no, you've no right to dictate who stays on my land." Sheriff Burke's scowl deepened. "Right or not, I can take it all if debts ain't paid. And you're walking a dangerous line, Mary. That Apache ain't welcome here. Laughter erupted from the men lingering near the saloon. Mary's stomach tightened. She had hoped for neutrality, for civility, but the town had no patience for dignity, only for spectacle. She could feel their judgment pressing against her like the desert wind against a shuttered window. One of the younger ranchers, a boy no older than her brother might have been, muttered, "She's lost her mind, letting a red man into her home." "Mind your tongue," Mary snapped, her voice louder than she intended. Every head turned toward her, and for a heartbeat silence ruled. The audacity of a woman scolding men in Dust Creek was nearly scandalous enough to silence the crowd, if only for a moment. But Burke's presence reminded her of the precariousness of her position. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Mary, I'll give you one chance. Send him away, or I'll find a reason to seize that land of yours. You'll have no say in it." Mary's heart pounded, but she held her gaze steady. "Then I'll defend it. Alone if I must." Burke's eyes narrowed. "Alone, huh? You think you're that strong?" Her reply was soft, almost a whisper, but carried more power than she knew she possessed. "I've survived worse." As she turned and rode out of town, the crowd parted like a wave, muttering insults behind her back. She could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered word, every judgmental smirk. She had grown used to whispers, but today's sting was sharper, more personal. The town had collectively decided she was no longer just a widow, but a scandal waiting to erupt. When she reached the ranch, the sun had sunk low behind the mesas, casting long shadows over the dust and fence posts. She dismounted, her hands trembling as she loosened the reins. Taza was there, kneeling beside the well, inspecting a rope that needed repair. He looked up, his dark eyes steady and calm. He had not approached, had not interfered in her dealings, yet he seemed to carry the silence of judgment the town had hurled at her. "They spoke against you," he said simply. Mary swallowed hard. She had been proud, insisting she could handle everything alone, but hearing the weight of their cruelty out loud, seeing it reflected in the unwavering gaze of the Apache who had silently helped her all these weeks, something inside her broke, just a little. "Let them," she said, her voice quieter now but firmer. "I'm used to it." Taza's hand hovered near hers, not touching, just close enough that she could feel the warmth. "Used to pain is still pain, Mary Dalton," he said softly. Her eyes stung, but she held her head high. She had survived storms, loneliness, and the death of a husband. She would survive this too, but now, for the first time, she understood that survival alone was not enough. Strength perhaps was better when shared. The wind swept across the prairie, carrying with it the whispers of Dust Creek. But inside the corral, Mary and Taza stood side by side, quiet, resolute, unbroken. The morning sun rose over the Dalton ranch in a gentle blaze of gold, brushing the corrals and barns with a warmth that seemed almost shy. Mary Dalton moved slowly through the yard, her hands calloused from work but steady, her mind weighed with thoughts of the town's cruelty from the previous day. Dust Creek had spat at her once more, and yet she had returned stubborn as ever. She glanced toward the horizon, half expecting to see Taza silently working. And there he was, tall, steady, leaning against the fence, eyes fixed on the distant mesas as if reading the land itself. She approached cautiously, unsure why the sight of him made her chest tighten. The weeks they had spent together had brought her a strange mix of comfort and unease. He did not demand attention, yet he commanded it. He did not speak often, yet his silence was louder than any words. He looked up as she neared, and for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible smile brushed his lips. He set down the piece of wood he had been smoothing with a knife and straightened, dusting his hands. "Mary," he said simply. "Yes?" Her voice caught in her throat. He took a step closer, measuring the distance between them as though calculating something far beyond her understanding. His dark eyes met hers, unwavering and deep, holding a weight that was neither threat nor pity but recognition. "If you need a husband, ma'am," he said slowly, carefully, "I reckon I could oblige." The world seemed to stop. For a heartbeat, she thought the wind itself had paused, the prairie holding its breath. Mary blinked, unsure whether to laugh or to cry, whether to be offended or grateful. She had heard proposals before, shouted in saloons or whispered under quilts, but never like this. Calm, deliberate, and entirely without pretense. You mean that?" She stammered. Her mind raced. An Apache? A man the town would never accept, and yet... and yet there was a steadiness in him, a dignity that no white man had ever shown her. "I do," he said simply. "I am not offering words or promises made of air. I am offering what I can give, my hands, my strength, my protection." Mary swallowed, feeling a mixture of disbelief and wonder. His words were neither poetic nor grandiose, yet they carried a gravity she could not ignore. This man, who had come into her life unbidden, had repaired her fences, fetched her water, mended her roof, and more quietly than she could have imagined, had begun to repair her heart. She looked at him, at the quiet pride in his posture, at the honesty etched into every line of his face, and in that moment she realized something she had long buried. She was lonely, profoundly so, and for the first time in years, she no longer feared the thought of sharing her life. "The town," she began, her voice tight with hesitation. "They won't accept this. They'll never forgive. They never forgave your husband either," Taza interrupted softly, his eyes steady on hers. "Let them watch. You live for you, not for them. What matters is here." He touched his chest over his heart. Here, Mary's breath caught. His calm certainty, his unwavering respect for her strength, it was more than she had ever dared hope for. She realized that this was not just a proposal. It was an acknowledgement of her resilience, a promise of partnership, a quiet declaration that she would never be alone again unless she chose it. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not of sorrow but of relief, of recognition, of something that had been missing for far too long. The prairie wind lifted her hair and carried with it the scent of dust and sage, and for the first time in years, Mary Dalton felt hope stir within her. She took a deep breath and met his gaze fully, letting go of fear, of pride, of every whisper of the town that had sought to shame her. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, I will have you by my side." Taza nodded, a simple motion, but the weight behind it was immense. There was no fanfare, no witness. Only the two of them and the vast open land stretching endlessly around them. And in that quiet, sunlit moment, Mary realized that life could be more than survival. It could be strength shared, trust built, and a love that was patient, steady, and fierce enough to face any storm. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the ranch, and together, they walked toward the corral. Side by side, the sky had darkened by late afternoon, clouds gathering like bruises over the horizon. Mary Dalton was inside, mending the hem of her husband's old coat, when the first rumbles of thunder rolled across the plains. The wind began to whip the dry grasses into frenzied spirals, and the air smelled of ozone and rain. She glanced nervously at the corral, where the horses shifted restlessly, tails flicking, hooves stamping against the dusty ground. Taza was already outside, moving with calm efficiency despite the growing storm. He checked the latches on the corral gates, adjusted the ropes that held the barn doors, and whispered quietly to the horses in his native tongue. Mary watched him, a mixture of admiration and unease swelling in her chest. She had never seen a man so unshakable in the face of danger, so composed even when the wind threatened to tear the buildings apart. "Storm's coming fast," she called from the doorway, her voice almost drowned by the rising gusts. "I know," he said without turning. "Go inside. Stay safe." She hesitated. She wanted to obey, to retreat to the safety of the house, but a sudden crack of lightning split the sky, striking the barn. Flames leapt up instantly, devouring the dry wood with hungry speed. The smell of smoke hit her, sharp and choking. Panic surged through her. "Taza!" she shouted, running toward him. "The barn, it's on fire!" He did not falter. With a single fluid motion, he unslung a bucket of water and began dousing the edges of the flames, moving closer to the structure than she dared. Mary's heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed another bucket, splashing water toward the fire. But it was clear she could not manage it alone. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice low but commanding. "You'll get hurt!" But Mary refused. She had lived too long with fear to let it dictate her actions now. She ran into the smoke, her hands raw and aching from the effort, following Taza's lead as he guided the frightened horses out of the corral one by one. The barn crackled and groaned, threatening to collapse with every gust of wind, and the heat pressed against their faces like a living thing. Together, they worked, wordless, synchronized, each instinctively knowing what the other would do. Taza's calm strength steadied her, gave her courage when her own faltered. When the last horse was safe, A large beam fell with a deafening crash where they had just stood moments before. Mary's chest heaved, lungs burning, yet a sense of awe washed over her. This man, this Apache, was her anchor in the chaos. By the time the storm passed, the barn was little more than a blackened skeleton, smoke curling from its charred beams. They stood side by side, soaked through ash and mud streaking their clothes and faces. Mary looked at Taza, ready to scold, ready to despair, but found instead a profound respect. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice trembling. "And I wasn't," he replied simply, meeting her gaze. "We did what had to be done." For the first time, Mary felt the weight of connection, the pull of partnership. She realized that for all the years she had been alone, surviving storms and loss, she had never truly faced one with someone who mattered by her side, and now she had Taza, steady, fearless, and unyielding. As the sun broke through the receding clouds, painting the prairie in bruised gold, Taza touched her shoulder lightly. "The land is still yours," he said softly, "and so is your courage. We protect both together." Mary's throat tightened. She had survived fire, wind, loneliness, and loss, yet the strength she felt now beside him was something new. It was the warmth of shared struggle, the silent promise that she would never face the world alone again. That night, as they cleaned soot from their hands and tended to the remaining animals, Mary realized that Dust Creek had changed, not because the storm had passed, but because something else had arrived. A bond forged in fire, steady and unbreakable, between a broken woman and the man who refused to leave her side. The prairie wind whispered outside, carrying the scent of rain and ash, and for the first time in years, Mary Dalton felt hope bloom amid the ruin. Word travels fast in a town like Dust Creek, especially when it carries scandal. By the time the smoke from Mary Dalton's burned barn had faded, rumors had already taken root. "She's living with a savage," the townsfolk whispered, voices low but venomous. "And he defends her now?" Sheriff Burke, emboldened by the town's disapproval, rode up to the ranch one late afternoon, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. His hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver, but his eyes blazed with the kind of fury born from wounded pride and authority challenged. "You let him stay on your land?" he demanded, spittle catching in the sunlight. "You're walking a dangerous line, Mary, and you'll pay for it." Mary stood at the corral gate, her arms crossed, the sun striking the lines of her face. She had faced storms, fire, and loneliness. She would not bow to threats now. "You'll have to shoot me first, Burke," she said evenly. Her voice carried across the yard, strong and unwavering, and for a moment, the sheriff faltered, surprised by her courage. Beside her, Taza leaned casually against a fence post, his dark eyes assessing the approaching men with the calm of a predator sizing up a threat. He did not draw a weapon, did not speak, but the sheer confidence in his stance radiated something more powerful than any pistol. Burke's face twisted with anger. "You think you're strong enough to stand alone?" He sneered. "You think a woman can fight a town?" Mary's jaw tightened. "I'm not alone." At that, Taza stepped forward. The movement was fluid, effortless, like a shadow unfurling across the prairie. His hand brushed the revolver at his side, not drawing it, but the motion was enough. The sheriff blinked as if realizing too late that Mary Dalton was no longer a solitary target. One of the men in Burke's posse, a brash young rancher named Cole, laughed nervously. "Come on, Mary, let him go. Ain't worth it." Taza's eyes, dark and unyielding, met Cole's. In them, Cole saw the depth of a lifetime's discipline, a predator's calm, and a warrior's honor. He faltered, stepping back. The others followed suit, shifting uneasily under the weight of Taza's quiet authority. "You will leave my land," Burke said finally, his voice tight, "or you'll answer for it." Taza did not reply. Instead, he moved a fraction closer to Mary, a silent promise of protection. The sheriff's men began to sense the futility of their threat. They were armed, but Taza was faster, stronger, and more precise than any of them could imagine. He did not need to strike. The air itself seemed to lean toward him, bending the balance of power in his favor. Mary felt a surge of something she had long denied herself: relief, trust, and fierce pride. She had spent years proving she could survive alone. But standing here, side by side with Taza, she realized she had never truly understood the power of partnership. Not until now. Burke's jaw clenched. He backed down, if only for now, his posse following mutely. The town would continue to whisper, continue to judge, but the line had been drawn. Mary Dalton was not a victim, not a widow to be pitied. She was a force, unyielding, unbroken, and guarded by a man who matched her strength in every way. As the dust settled, Taza turned to Mary, his expression unreadable but steady. "They tested you," he said softly. "And they tested me, but we did not falter." Mary nodded, her chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline. She realized that strength alone had never been enough. It was courage shared, the silent bond of trust, and the willingness to stand together that had shifted the balance. That night, as the prairie wind whispered through the corral, Mary Dalton felt a profound change settle in her heart. Dust Creek's judgment could not reach them. Its whispers could not undo what had been forged in fire, in storm, and now in bloodless confrontation. Side by side, they were unbreakable, and for the first time in years, Mary allowed herself to hope. Not for survival, but for life, love, and the quiet promise of partnership that could endure anything. The day dawned crisp and golden, the desert stretching endlessly around the Dalton Ranch. Dust Creek was still a few miles away, and Mary Dalton had insisted that this wedding, if it were to happen, would not take place in the town that had judged her every step. Taza had agreed silently, his dark eyes scanning the horizon as if seeking the perfect place among the mesas and canyons that had been his home long before settlers arrived. They rode side by side, the sun warming their shoulders, the dry wind carrying the scent of sage and wild grasses. Mary wore a simple white dress, stitched carefully with her own hands from an old bolt of cloth, and a veil of fine netting that fluttered gently in the breeze. She carried no bouquet. The desert itself provided its gifts, small blossoms of pink and yellow peeking through the rocks. Taza led her to a secluded canyon, a natural amphitheater of sandstone cliffs that glowed like fire in the morning sun. The place was silent, save for the whisper of wind through the crevices and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Mary felt the weight of the moment settle over her, a combination of awe, fear, and the strange exhilaration of stepping into something entirely new. A small group of Taza's kin had gathered, faces marked by the sun and wind, expressions solemn yet accepting. They had come not to witness but to honor. Mary could sense their respect, a quiet acknowledgement of her strength and her choice. She felt both an outsider and a participant in a world far older than Dust Creek, one that measured worth not by gossip or gold, but by courage and heart. Taza stepped forward, his presence steady and commanding. In his hands he held a carved eagle feather, polished and worn by time, the symbol of protection, freedom, and the bond they were about to form. He extended it to her slowly, the weight of his gaze upon her unwavering. Mary accepted it, feeling the smooth contours of the wood and the softness of the feather, and with that touch, the ceremony began. No preacher, no vows written in ink, only the language of silence, the gestures of commitment, the echoing presence of the earth itself. Taza touched her hands, palms pressed together, and the world seemed to shrink to the canyon walls, the wind and the two of them. "You are my partner," he said in English, his voice low and resonant, not by law of man but by bond of heart. "I protect you. I honor you. You walk beside me as I walk beside you." Mary felt tears prick her eyes. She had spent years believing love was a fleeting thing, a promise that ended in loss. But here, under the burning sun, amidst the quiet grandeur of the desert, she understood that love could also be patient, steadfast, and unyielding. She spoke then, her voice trembling but clear. "And I you. I will stand with you as you have stood with me, not as a possession, not as a shadow, but as equal, as companion, as partner." Taza nodded, lifting the feather and letting the wind catch it. The sun glinted off its carved surface, casting flickers of light across the canyon walls. There was no need for rings or formalities. The earth itself witnessed their bond, the sky itself blessing the union. When the ceremony concluded, Taza produced a small satchel of desert wildflowers, handing them to Mary. They were not ornate or cultivated, but simple and vibrant, a reminder of the land that sustained them both. She tucked the blooms into her dress and for the first time in years felt truly seen, respected, and loved. As they rode back toward the ranch side by side, Mary realized the enormity of what had changed. Dust Creek could whisper and sneer all it wanted. They had no hold over her heart anymore. With Taza, she had found not just a husband, but a protector, a partner, and a love that matched the strength of the desert itself. Enduring, fierce and untamed, the canyon faded behind them, but its memory remained, a sacred witness to the beginning of a new life, a new bond, and a love that would face any storm, fire, or judgment the world dared to send. It had been a week since the desert wedding, and Mary Dalton's life at the ranch had begun to settle into a rhythm she had never known before. The town of Dust Creek, however, had not. Whispers still followed her across the dusty streets. Sneers and sideways glances lingered wherever she went, but Mary no longer sought their approval. She had Taza by her side, steady, calm, and unshakable, and that was all the validation she needed. Then came the day that changed everything. Taza rode into town alone, his dark figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the morning sun. He carried nothing but a small leather pouch slung across his chest. The townsfolk began to murmur immediately, their curiosity sharpened by suspicion and lingering prejudice. What was the Apache doing in Dust Creek? Was he there to threaten, to steal, to take what wasn't his? He dismounted quietly outside Sheriff Burke's office. The sheriff himself stepped out, pistol at his side, his face a mixture of anger and incredulity. "What do you want, Taza?" he barked. "I warned your wife." Taza's gaze didn't waver. "I come with a gift," he said, simply lifting the small pouch. He strode forward, leaving the sheriff blinking, unsure whether to reach for his gun or step aside. He placed the pouch on the sheriff's desk with deliberate care. Burke glared down at it, finally prying it open. Inside was gold dust, fine and glimmering, enough to cover every debt Mary Dalton owed. The corral repairs, the supplies, even the taxes the sheriff had threatened to seize. There was more than enough for the entire town to marvel at if they dared to count it. Burke's jaw tightened. Where did this come from?" Taza's voice was quiet but carried the weight of authority. "From the canyon," he said simply. "A place few white men have seen. The land gave it freely. I give it as proof that her land, her home, is hers alone. She owes nothing to the town, to you, or to anyone who dares question her right to live as she chooses." The office fell silent. The gold sparkled under the sunlight streaming through the window, but the real impact lay elsewhere. In the certainty, the honor, and the courage Taza exuded. No words could convey it better than the simple act itself. One by one, the sheriff's men looked away, uncomfortable. Burke himself struggled to maintain composure, but even he could not deny the message. This was no ordinary gift of wealth. It was a declaration of respect, of protection, and of power tempered by fairness. The Apache had not come to threaten, to demand, or to intimidate. He had come to honor, to enforce justice where the law had faltered, and to make plain that Mary Dalton's place in Dust Creek was hers, by right and by merit. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Sensing the tension spilling from the sheriff's office, they whispered among themselves, some incredulous, some fearful, others beginning to recognize that this was no longer gossip, but a fact they could not deny. Dust Creek, so eager to judge, was finally silenced by a single, deliberate act of respect and power. When Taza returned to the ranch that afternoon, Mary waited on the porch, her hands clasped nervously. He approached without a word, the pouch now empty, the gesture complete. "They'll think twice now," he said softly. "Maybe more than twice. But it doesn't matter. What matters is you and this land. You've earned it. And so have I, and to stand with you." Mary felt her chest tighten, tears prickling her eyes. This man, this steadfast Apache who had come into her life unbidden, had done more than protect her land or repay debts. He had silenced the town, quelled their whispers, and in doing so, had offered her the one thing she had been missing for years: validation, honor, and safety without conditions. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. The wind blew across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust and something that felt like freedom. For the first time, Mary Dalton understood fully that love could be an act of courage, that trust could be enforced with respect, and that a partnership could withstand even the harshest judgment. Side by side, they looked out over the land, hers, theirs, knowing that the past, the town, and its cruelty could no longer touch them. The gold was gone, the debts cleared, but the real gift remained. A bond forged in trust, honor, and quiet, unyielding strength, and Dust Creek would never speak against Mary Dalton again. Years passed over Dust Creek, and the once whispering town slowly came to accept a truth it had long resisted. Mary Dalton was no ordinary woman. And Taza, the Apache warrior at her side, was no ordinary man. The town still murmured, but their whispers were now laced with respect rather than scorn. Children would peek through windows to catch a glimpse of the couple tending the ranch, and adults would nod silently, acknowledging what they could neither change nor deny. Mary's ranch thrived, her hard work and careful planning transforming the property into something more than a homestead, a sanctuary carved from the unforgiving prairie. Taza remained her steadfast partner in all things, his quiet strength a constant presence. Together they repaired fences, tended livestock, and worked the land side by side. Mary's laugh, once scarce and tinged with pain, returned, ringing across the fields and brightening the days of those who ventured near. Travelers passing through Dust Creek began to tell tales of the Dalton Ranch. They spoke of the tall Apache warrior who never raised his voice in anger, yet commanded the land and its people with unwavering authority. They spoke of the widow who had endured loss and cruelty, who had faced fire, storm, and judgment and had emerged unbroken. Most of all, they spoke of a partnership forged in respect, courage, and love, a bond that seemed as enduring as the desert itself. On certain evenings, Mary and Taza would ride to the top of the bluff overlooking the plains. From there the sunset stretched endlessly, painting the sky in hues of gold, crimson, and violet. They would sit in silence, the wind carrying the scent of sage and wild grasses, watching the world move below them. It was in these moments, away from Dust Creek's lingering judgment, that Mary understood the depth of what she had found. A life not only survived but fully lived, rich with trust, honor, and unwavering companionship. The townsfolk, too, could not ignore the change Taza had brought. When disputes arose or danger threatened the surrounding lands, Taza's presence alone, calm, deliberate, and fearless, served as both shield and warning. Slowly, prejudice faded. The Apache warrior who had once been feared and whispered about became a symbol of integrity and quiet power, and Mary Dalton, once derided and underestimated, became a figure of admiration, a woman who had claimed her place in a harsh world and held it with grace and courage. Legends grew, as they always do. Travelers told stories of a widow and her Apache husband who had faced fire and storm together, who had silenced an entire town with a gift of honor, and who had forged a love that was patient, fierce, and enduring. These stories became part of the fabric of Dust Creek, whispered around campfires and passed down through generations. Mary sometimes laughed softly when she heard these tales, shaking her head at the exaggeration, but she never denied them. The truth, she knew, was more powerful than legend. A love born not of convenience but of respect and courage. A partnership built not on survival alone, but on shared strength, trust, and unwavering devotion. In the evenings, when the wind swept through the prairie and the sky burned with the colors of dusk, Mary and Taza would stand together by the corral, silhouetted against the horizon. They did not speak when words were unnecessary. The land had witnessed their trials. The storms had tested their courage, and the fires had tempered their bond. All that remained was a quiet certainty. They belonged to each other, and their story, like the desert itself, would endure, and so Dust Creek remembered them, the widow and the Apache, partners in life and legend. A woman who had once been broken, and a warrior who had walked into her life with nothing but honor, strength, and patience. Together they had tamed not only the land but the whispers of the town, leaving behind a tale that would echo for generations, that even in the wild, untamed West, love could be as fierce, enduring, and untouchable as the desert sun.